King Charles III has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering months of deafening silence, issuing a decree so devastating, so surgically calculated, so utterly annihilating to the woman who has stood beside him for more than 5 decades that Buckingham Palace itself was plunged into a state of suffocating paralysis before the ink had even dried upon the parchment. In a single stroke of a fountain pen borne by the trembling hand of a monarch who had once fought his own family, his own mother, his own nation for the right to place a crown upon her head, Charles has now officially, irrevocably, and publicly removed Queen Camilla from every future coronation ceremony of the House of Windsor, stripping her not merely of ornamental privilege but of the sacred constitutional presence that had, until this very hour, been considered inviolable. The order, sealed with the personal cipher of the sovereign and countersigned in the private study at Clarence House shortly before dawn, does not merely rewrite protocol. It obliterates a decades-long promise, one whispered in candlelit corridors, one sworn upon the memory of a woman whose ghost has never truly left the palace walls. What exactly did the late Queen Elizabeth II predict in a hidden letter now surfacing from the vaults of Windsor, a letter Charles had sworn upon his mother's grave never to open? Why did the sovereign explicitly forbid Camilla from ever again standing beside the Prince and Princess of Wales at the moment of their ascension? And what dark, hidden tragedy, buried beneath 27 years of institutional silence, finally compelled a king to turn against the very woman for whom he had risked everything? The morning had begun in the cavernous, hauntingly quiet library of Clarence House, where pale November light filtered through the mullioned windows in slanted, ghostly ribbons, catching the dust motes that danced above the mahogany desk like restless spirits refusing to settle. The room smelled of aged paper, of beeswax polish, of the faint mineral scent of old ink, and beneath it all, the barely perceptible aroma of white gardenias, the flowers Queen Elizabeth had favored, arranged each Tuesday morning by a florist who had served the household for 31 years, and who, on this particular dawn, had wept quietly as she trimmed the stems. Upon the desk lay a single cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by time, its face bearing only 2 words written in the unmistakable, painstakingly deliberate hand of the late sovereign, for Charles. The wax seal at its center was crimson, deep as arterial blood, pressed with the private cipher of Elizabeth Regina, not the state seal used for constitutional business, but the small, intimate crest she reserved for matters of the heart, matters of the family, matters that no minister, no archbishop, no courtier was ever meant to touch. Beside it rested a second object of infinitely more sinister weight, a tarnished brass key, no larger than a matchstick, wrapped in a length of pale blue ribbon faded almost to gray. The king stared at both, his hands folded upon the leather blotter, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the charcoal of his morning suit, his face, that face the world had known for 7 decades, carved into an expression of such quiet, agonizing resolve that Sir Clive Alderton, his principal private secretary, standing 3 paces behind the sovereign, felt the color drain from his own cheeks and the pulse in his throat quicken to a frantic, uneven rhythm. "For 27 years, Charles said at last, his voice growly, weighted, cracked at the edges like old parchment folded too many times. "The world has spoken for her. Today I am speaking for her." He did not look up as he said it. His eyes remained fixed upon the envelope, upon the crimson seal, upon the impossible task that had finally, inescapably come to rest before him. Sir Clive did not respond. He could not. The encrypted feed from the private communications suite 2 floors below was already flickering with incoming signals. The Cabinet Office, the Lord Chamberlain's department, the Archbishop of Canterbury's private line, all attempting to reach the sovereign, all being routed to voicemail on the King's explicit standing order. Somewhere in the bowels of Buckingham Palace, a senior press officer was screaming into a telephone that had gone dead. Somewhere in Kensington Palace, the Prince of Wales was being woken by his own private secretary with words so carefully chosen, so trembling with disbelief, that William had risen from bed still half dreaming, uncertain whether the news he was hearing belonged to the waking world or the nightmare he had never quite escaped since the summer of 1997. It had been August of that year, in the small hours before dawn, when a 15-year-old boy sat upon the edge of his bed at Balmoral, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face wet with tears he did not permit himself to wipe away, and listened to the rhythmic click of Oxford shoes upon the polished corridor outside his room. He had known, even then, that the footsteps were not those of his father. They were the footsteps of a stranger, a man in a charcoal suit, a man with a clipboard and cold, pale eyes, a man who had come to explain in measured and professionally sympathetic tones precisely what the boy would be expected to do at the funeral, how far he would walk, how straight he would hold his shoulders, how he must not, under any circumstances, weep in the presence of the cameras. William had never forgotten that man's shoes. He had never forgotten the sound of them retreating down the corridor after the instructions had been delivered, and he had never, in all the years since, been permitted to know the man's true name. For men such as these did not have names in the ordinary sense. They had functions, they had assignments, they had, above all, continuity, for they remained in the palace long after kings and queens had passed away. And they were, as Diana herself had once whispered to her son beneath the chandeliers of Kensington Palace, the true architects of everything that would come to pass. The letter upon Charles's desk had been written in the final winter of Elizabeth's life, in the small sitting room at Sandringham where she had passed her last Christmas, and it had been sealed with instructions that it be delivered to her eldest son only upon the occurrence of a very specific event, an event she had described in the accompanying memorandum with such mathematical precision, such chilling foresight, that the king, upon first reading the outer instructions 3 months earlier, had set the envelope aside and refused, for 11 weeks, to touch it again. The event, she had written, would be a moment in which Camilla, drawing upon her position as queen consort, would attempt to insert herself into the ceremonial architecture of the future coronation of William and Catherine, attempting not merely to attend, which was her constitutional right, but to occupy a position of visible authority beside the new sovereigns, a position that Elizabeth had, in her final months, come to regard as the single most dangerous constitutional development the House of Windsor could face. And that moment, Sir Clive had regretfully informed the king 48 hours earlier, had now arrived. Camilla's private office had, through channels both delicate and unmistakable, begun to circulate a proposal, modest in appearance, ruthless in implication, that the queen consort should retain a ceremonial dowager role at every future coronation of the House of Windsor, positioned to the immediate right of the new sovereign, robed in imperial purple, crowned with a diadem of her own choosing. It was, on its face, a matter of protocol. It was, in truth, a claim upon the future. Charles's hand trembled as he lifted the letter. The crimson wax cracked with a soft, deliberate snap that seemed, in the silence of the library, to echo like the report of a distant rifle. Sir Clive flinched. Outside the windows, a raven cried once from the chestnut tree beyond the terrace, and somewhere in the depths of the house, an antique long-case clock chimed the quarter hour with a sound so resonant, so mournful, that the king paused for a moment before unfolding the pages within. The paper was cream, the ink was blue-black, the handwriting was unmistakable. The small, controlled, exquisitely disciplined script of a woman who had ruled for 70 years, and who had in her final months permitted herself, perhaps for the first time in her life, to write without the ceremonial guardrails of monarchy. "My dearest Charles," the letter began, and Charles read the words aloud in a voice so soft that Sir Clive had to lean forward to catch them. "If this letter has been opened, then the moment I long feared has come. You must now do what I could not bring myself to do in my own reign. You must protect the boys, you must protect Catherine, and you must, my darling son, protect the memory of the woman whom this family has spent 27 years attempting, and failing, to erase. Diana." The name had not been written. It did not need to be. Charles closed his eyes, and for a single suffocating moment, he was no longer a 77-year-old monarch in a library in London, but a younger man standing upon the terrace at Highgrove, in the spring of 1995, watching a woman in a pale blue dress walk across the lawn towards him, her hair caught by the wind, her expression composed in that particular way she had of holding sorrow behind a smile, so as not to burden anyone who might witness it. She had come to him that afternoon not to argue, not to plead, but to warn. "Charles," she had said, her voice low, her eyes fixed upon his with an intensity that had made him look away. "There is a man in the palace. I will not name him to you, because you already know who he is. He is arranging things. He is arranging me. And one day, when I am no longer here, he will arrange our boys. He will arrange their wives. He will arrange their coronations. And unless someone in this family finally has the courage to stop him, he will arrange the destruction of everything your mother has spent her life protecting." Charles had not believed her. He had, in fact, been angered by the accusation, dismissing it as another symptom of the paranoia the palace physicians had begun quietly to attribute to her in their confidential memoranda. He had turned away from her upon the terrace. He had gone inside. He had not, in the weeks that followed, spoken of the conversation to anyone. And 2 years and 4 months later, in a concrete tunnel beneath the Place de l'Alma in Paris, the man in the charcoal suit had, indeed, arranged her. The letter continued in his mother's steady hand. "I have known his name for many years, Charles. I have watched him operate through 3 prime ministers, 4 archbishops, and the entirety of your late wife's marriage to you. He was there when the decision was made regarding the Panorama interview. He was there when the security detail was reduced in the months preceding Paris. He was there when the funeral protocols were drafted. He is there still. He sits in a small office on the 2nd floor of a building I shall not name in this letter, and he holds a file upon each of us, a file upon me, a file upon you, a file upon William, a file upon Harry, and I regret to inform you, a file upon Camilla. It is the file upon Camilla that concerns me most gravely, and it is the reason I write to you now." Sir Clive, standing behind the king, felt his knees weaken and reached, discreetly, for the edge of a bookshelf to steady himself. He had served the royal household for 23 years. He had heard rumors. He had on 3 occasions caught fragments of conversation in corridors that ought to have been empty. He had never, until this moment, permitted himself to believe that the fragments amounted to anything more than the ambient paranoia of an institution accustomed to being observed. Now, however, he understood. Now, as the king read on, his voice steady but his hands visibly shaking, Sir Clive understood that the whispers had been true, that the woman who had spent 70 years upon the throne had known, and had waited, and had left behind this letter as the final act of a reign whose deepest secret had never been permitted to reach the public. "Camilla has been useful to him, Charles. I do not say this to wound you. I say this because you must understand it before you make the decision that only you can make. She was placed in your life at a moment when the institution required her to be there. She was rehabilitated in the public eye by a campaign coordinated through the same office that had, only years earlier, arranged the isolation of Diana. She was permitted to marry you because her presence beside you served an institutional purpose that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with control. She does not know this, my darling. I want you to understand that. She was not complicit. She was, in her own way, as much a piece upon the board as any of us have been. But she is now attempting, whether by her own ambition or by his continued influence, I cannot say, to extend that influence into the reign of your son. And this, Charles, is what I cannot permit. This is what you cannot permit." 20 million people were, at that very hour, watching the live palace correspondents standing bewildered outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, uncertain what they had been summoned to witness, aware only that a statement of unprecedented gravity was imminent. Across the country, in pubs in Edinburgh where the morning shift had just begun pouring the first pints of the day, glasses froze midway to lips. In the tea rooms of Bath, elderly women set down their cups and stared at televisions that had, moments earlier, been showing weather forecasts. In the newsrooms of Fleet Street, editors screamed at their political correspondents to abandon whatever they had been writing and prepare for the largest palace story of the decade. And in a small flat in Montecito, California, a woman with copper-colored hair sat upon the edge of her bed with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to a voice she had not heard in months, a voice that belonged to her husband, a voice that was saying, over and over, my father has done it, my father has finally done it." The antique rotary telephone upon Charles's desk, the same telephone his mother had used, the same telephone upon which she had received the news of Diana's death in the small hours of a Paris morning, began, at that moment, to ring. Charles did not lift his head from the letter. He knew who it was. He knew the number that was reaching him through the encrypted palace exchange. Sir Clive, hesitating for the briefest of moments, crossed to the desk and lifted the receiver, listened for the space of 3 heartbeats, and then, without a word, offered the receiver to the king. Charles took it. He pressed it to his ear, and he heard, from the other end of the line, the voice of his eldest son, a voice stripped bare of the sovereign authority it had been trained since infancy to project, a voice reduced to something that sounded, unmistakably, like the broken sob of the 15-year-old boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin in the September rain. "Papa," William said, and the single word was so raw, so cracked, so utterly stripped of ceremony, that the king closed his eyes and pressed his free hand to his mouth. "Papa, is it true? Is it truly true? Has she left me a letter as well?" "Yes, my boy," Charles whispered, and for a moment neither man spoke, and the only sound upon the encrypted line was the sound of 2 men, a father and a son, a monarch and his heir, attempting, and failing, to breathe steadily. "Yes, William, she has left a letter for each of us. Catherine's is with hers, Harry's has been dispatched this morning to Montecito, and mine is open before me now." "What does it say, Papa? What does mine say?" "I have not read yours, my boy. I would not. She addressed it to you, and to you alone. It is upon my desk. I shall have it brought to Kensington within the hour." There was a long silence, and then William, his voice steadier now but no less devastated, said the words that Charles had, in his deepest heart, been waiting for. "Papa, do what she has asked. Whatever she has asked, do it. Catherine and I will stand behind you. The boys will understand, when they are older. But please, Papa, please do not let her have arranged us as well." The line went dead. Charles set the receiver down with a hand that no longer trembled. He looked up, at last, and met Sir Clive's eyes across the desk. "Summon the Lord Chamberlain," he said quietly. "Summon the Archbishop of Canterbury, summon the Prime Minister, and summon Her Majesty the Queen." He paused. He drew in a long, slow breath. In that order, the tarnished brass key upon the desk, the key that had accompanied the letter, wrapped in its faded blue ribbon, opened, as it transpired, a small locked drawer within a bureau in the private apartments at Windsor Castle. A bureau that had belonged to Elizabeth II, and that had, since her death, remained sealed under standing orders that only her successor might approach it. Within that drawer, Sir Clive would discover, some 4 hours later, a second file, a file so meticulously assembled, so forensically documented, that even the retired MI6 analyst summoned in confidence to authenticate it would set down the pages after 20 minutes of reading and quietly ask for a glass of water. The file contained transcripts, it contained photographs, it contained a chronology, prepared in Elizabeth's own hand, of every significant intervention made by the man in the charcoal suit, the man whose name, at last, appeared upon the opening page of the file, though it would not, for reasons of state, ever be spoken aloud to the public. He had joined the household as a junior aide in 1979. He had been present at every consequential moment. He had, as Elizabeth had written, arranged, and he was, as the file confirmed with an accompanying memorandum dated only 6 weeks before Elizabeth's death, still in post, still operating. Still, at this very hour, seated at his desk on the second floor of the building the late Queen had declined to name, a building that stood, as it happened, not 5 minutes' walk from Clarence House itself. Camilla learned of the decision at 10:47 that morning, in the drawing room of her private apartments, where she had been reading a letter from her sister and drinking a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold in her hand. Her private secretary, a woman of impeccable discretion and 31 years' service to the household, delivered the news in a voice that trembled despite every effort to control it, and Camilla, who had, across 7 decades of scandal, humiliation, and eventual triumph, developed an aristocratic composure that had become legendary within the household, set down her teacup with a hand so steady that the porcelain did not so much as chime against the saucer, and said only, "I see." She rose. She walked to the window. She looked out across the winter gardens for the space of perhaps 2 minutes, and then she said, without turning, "Please inform His Majesty that I understand. Please inform him that I shall not contest the decision. And please inform him that I should like, if he will permit it, to speak with him privately before the announcement is made public." Her private secretary nodded, withdrew, and closed the door behind her, and Camilla, alone in the drawing room, sat down upon the edge of a small brocade chair, and permitted herself, for the first and only time that morning, a single silent tear. She had known, in the deepest reaches of her heart, that this moment might one day come. She had known it since the winter of 1995, when a woman in a pale blue dress had appeared, uninvited, at a small dinner in Gloucestershire, and had spoken to her briefly in a corridor outside the powder room, saying only, in a voice devoid of malice but heavy with a sorrow Camilla had never forgotten, "They will use you against me, and one day, when I am gone, they will use you against my boys. I do not blame you, Camilla, but I hope, when that day comes, that you will remember what I have said." Camilla had not known, at the time, what to make of the words. She had, in the years that followed, tried very hard not to remember them, and she had, on this cold November morning in the winter of her own reign, been reminded of them at last, not by an enemy, not by a courtier, not by the press, but by the man she had loved for more than 50 years, the man who had risked everything to marry her, the man who now, in the library of Clarence House, was setting a fountain pen against a sheet of headed paper and signing an order that would remove her from every future coronation of the House of Windsor. Catherine, upon receiving her own letter that afternoon at Adelaide Cottage, read it once through and then a second time, and then, without a word to anyone, walked into the small sitting room where William was standing at the window, and she folded her arms around him from behind, and she rested her cheek against the space between his shoulder blades, and she said, very softly, "She knew, William. She knew all of it, and she has protected us." William did not turn. He could not. He stood at the window and watched the winter light fade across the gardens, and he wept, silently, as he had not permitted himself to weep since a September morning in 1997. Behind him, Catherine held on. She did not let go, and in the quiet of the cottage, in the fading light of a November afternoon, a promise made 27 years earlier upon the terrace of Highgrove was, at last, being kept. Harry received his letter at 2:17 in the morning California time, delivered by a private courier who had flown from London on a chartered aircraft with instructions that the package be placed directly into the prince's hands and no others. He opened it in the kitchen of his home in Montecito, standing barefoot upon the tiled floor, with Megan seated at the counter behind him watching him with an expression of quiet, wounded love. He read the letter through, he set it down upon the counter, he looked at his wife, and he said, in a voice that shook so violently he could barely form the words, "Mummy, Mummy has spoken. After all these years, Mummy has finally spoken. Meghan rose from her stool. She crossed the kitchen. She took her husband into her arms. And she said nothing at all, because there was nothing that could be said, because the boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin at the age of 12 had at last received the words she had been waiting 27 years to give him. The announcement was made at 3 o'clock that afternoon from the staterooms of Buckingham Palace, read aloud by the Lord Chamberlain in a voice that carried across the encrypted broadcast feeds to every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond. It was brief. It was formal. It did not name the man in the charcoal suit, for the constitutional consequences of naming him would have been catastrophic, and Elizabeth had in her wisdom foreseen this and had written in her letter that the naming must wait, that it must fall, one day, to William, when William was king, and when the machinery had been dismantled sufficiently that the naming could be survived. What the announcement did state, in language of measured but unmistakable finality, was that Her Majesty Queen Camilla, in consultation with His Majesty the King, had determined that her role at all future coronations of the House of Windsor would be one of private attendance only, and that the ceremonial architecture of those future coronations would be structured around the sovereign and consort alone, with no dowager position, no imperial robe, no diadem, and no visible seat of secondary authority. The statement did not explain, it did not justify, it did not defend, it simply declared, and in declaring, it obliterated, in a single sentence, an ambition that had been quietly nurtured within a small corner of the palace for the better part of 2 years. The reaction was instantaneous and cataclysmic. Within 11 minutes, Buckingham Palace's telephone exchange had received more than 4,000 calls. Within 23 minutes, the palace press office had issued a follow-up statement declining, in the most polite terms available to the English language, to answer any further questions. Within 41 minutes, a black car had departed a certain building not 5 minutes' walk from Clarence House, carrying a man in a charcoal suit whose face had been observed by the doorman to be pale, drawn, and marked by an expression that the doorman would later describe, in a private conversation with his wife, as the look of a man who had just been told that the game was over. The car did not return. The office on the second floor of the building was, by the following morning, empty. The nameplate had been removed. The files had been transferred, under sealed instructions signed personally by the king, to a secure archive at Windsor to which only the sovereign held the key. Charles remained in the library at Clarence House until well after nightfall. He did not eat. He did not receive visitors. He sat at the mahogany desk with his mother's letter open before him, and he read it, and reread it, and permitted himself, at last, the tears he had not permitted himself upon the day of her funeral. Sir Clive, entering the library shortly after 10 o'clock with a tray bearing a pot of tea and a slice of the shortbread the king's household had prepared to his mother's recipe for more than 60 years, found the sovereign asleep in his chair, his head bowed forward, his hand resting upon the letter. His face, that face the world had known for 7 decades, softened, at last, into an expression of a man who had, after a very long time, laid down a burden he had not known he was carrying. The letter, in its final paragraph, had contained a single instruction that Charles had not read aloud, and would not read aloud, and would carry with him to his own grave. "When it is done, my darling," Elizabeth had written, "take the letter to the small chapel at Sandringham where your grandmother is buried, and burn it there, upon the stone before the altar. Take also the file, and burn that. Keep only the key. Give the key to William, and tell him that when his own moment comes, he will know what to do with it. And then, my dear son, go and stand for a while at the grave of the woman whom this family has not permitted itself, in 27 years, to properly mourn. Stand there in the winter light, and tell her, from me, that the swallow has at last flown free." Diana had, as a child at Althorpe, kept a small collection of carved wooden swallows upon her bedroom windowsill, a gift from her grandmother, who had told her that the swallow was the bird of homecoming, the bird that flew across the widest oceans and always, always returned to the place of its beginning. She had spoken of the swallows to her sons. She had spoken of them, once in a letter to Elizabeth, in the summer of 1996, a letter that Elizabeth had preserved, and that lay now in the file upon Charles's desk, its edges soft with age, its ink faded but legible. "One day," Diana had written, "when I am no longer here to speak for myself, I hope that someone in this family will remember the swallows, and will let them fly." The broadcast cut to black at 4:17 that afternoon. The palace correspondents were still speaking. The commentators were still speculating. And then, without warning, without music, without ceremony, every screen carrying the live feed from the palace gates went dark, not through failure, not through interference, but through the quiet, deliberate order of a monarch who had determined that the moment required silence rather than commentary, and that the nation, for once, should be permitted to sit with what it had just been told, without the mediating voices of those whose profession it was to explain. The silence lasted for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It was, by some considerable margin, the longest broadcast silence in the history of British public service television. In a small chapel at Sandringham, 3 days later, in the pale grey light of a December morning, King Charles III stood alone before an altar of Norfolk stone, and set a match to a letter and a file, and watched them burn. He wore no ceremonial robes, he carried no attendants. He held in his gloved hand a small tarnished brass key wrapped in a length of pale blue ribbon faded almost to grey. When the flames had subsided, he gathered the ashes into a small silver vessel, and he walked out into the churchyard, and he stood for a long time at a spot beneath a yew tree, where no grave was marked but where, in the private knowledge of the family, a small bundle of white gardenias had been laid every August for 27 consecutive years. He scattered the ashes there, he knelt, he spoke, aloud, words that no one heard, and that no record shall ever contain. And when he rose at last, and turned to walk back to the small black car waiting at the churchyard gate, an observer in the tower of the chapel, one of the household staff, an elderly woman who had served the family for 42 years, would later swear that she saw, in the winter sky above the yew tree, a single dark bird rise from the branches and turn, once, in a wide arc against the pale morning, before flying east, towards the sea. The truth at last had saved her boys. The swallow had, at last, flown free. And in the vast and ancient silence of a nation that had just witnessed the quiet undoing of a piece of machinery that had operated within its palace walls for more than 4 decades, the House of Windsor drew, for the first time in a very long time, a breath that was truly its own. The secret was out.